Now the time for questions and answers is here. We ask you two things. Keep them short, and instead of making statements, if you could just address questions specifically from members of the panel, we'll do one thing. If we have questions, we will have 3 at a time, and then you will just have the panel address them. I hope it works with you. So the floor is now yours. Any questions for our panelists today? Okay. Mr. Jeff Bress.
Thank you. I have a question for Tina Stegate from the Marshall Islands. If you can talk a little bit about your role in Secretary General's Climate Action Summit that's coming up in September.
Okay. Should we?
Could you go?
Yeah, let's try to. Any more questions? Or should we start with one and then maybe more will come? Okay, let's do that. Tina, you want to address?
Thanks for the question, Jeff. So the Marshall Islands is co-leading with Ireland on the youth and public mobilization track of the Climate Summit. The Climate Summit is divided, and it's artificial divisions, but we needed to organize the work, into 9 tracks. There's energy, nature-based solutions, for whatever reason I'm blanking out, but there's many, and we're doing the youth and public mobilization piece of that. And really, we're sort of extra arms for the Secretary General to look at proposals that are coming in from all around the world, multi-stakeholder often, of concrete actions that can be taken that are, again, that are transformative in scale. As you listen to the discussions of this summit, it's really trying to change the way that the UN has engaged up to this point. A lot of the action or activity has been around negotiations and negotiations and negotiations, decades of negotiations. And there's a clear recognition by everyone, I think, who is working in climate, that the negotiations are over. We have to act. It's time to act. And this summit is really focused on action. I think the 2 words to take away are action and ambition. And looking at concrete actions that can be taken, that can be presented at the summit and immediately implemented the next day. And so in our particular track, we are very excited as the Marshall Islands to be engaging on the youth and public mobilization side. This is something very close to the heart of my own president, who is by profession an educator. And also because our youth have been extremely active, and youth actually across the Pacific as climate warriors have been a real voice pushing the needle on this conversation and really showing the strength, and a big voice behind 1.5 and all of the things that came out of Paris. And so we recognize that youth are, I think, the most exciting piece of this conversation at the moment. In terms of public mobilization, I think maybe many of you in this room know about the climate strikes that are happening. And there's one planned for the Friday before the climate summit. Maybe what you don't hear about is all of the amazing work that has happened in other parts of the world, but doesn't get the same kind of media attention. And from our perspective, we would like to make sure that those voices are also showcased, and the actions that are taking place on the ground by youth to run programs that are in fact changing, not just changing the conversation, but changing the trajectory, changing the course. As Corinna had said, what are people doing to change our course? And that's what this Climate Summit is about.
Thank you. No questions. Oh, good. Please, if you can state your name and the organization you represent, that would be great. Let's see if and the light has to turn from green to red. Don't ask me why red means you can speak, green means you cannot.
Hello, I'm Connie Rinsing. My question is for Corinna Gore, and I was interested to hear about the Religions for the Earth Summit that happened long ago. Can you tell me more about how your organization continues to work with different faiths and encourage them in this work?
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you very much. We are based at Union Theological Seminary, Center for Earth Ethics, and we follow up on the work of the Religions for the Earth conference in several ways. For one thing, we do, as I mentioned, this annual ministers training. So we divide our work into 4 program areas: the sustainability and global affairs, environmental justice and civic engagement, original caretakers, and eco-ministry. And they all overlap, of course. But within eco-ministry and the annual ministers training, we're really looking, again, on this theme of action and making those changes to reach out to people who are working in faith communities and to understand how we can make the changes both in culture and also in laws and policies. So systemic change is definitely one of the focal points. And I know many have heard that famous quote from Martin Luther King about true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs reconstructing. And that is definitely the spirit of faith activism that we bring to these ministers' trainings. So that's one way. And we also really want to work more on that change of the economic development paradigm, engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals and that process of understanding how do we measure development, how do we change this this way in which externalities, this language of economics, of externalities in the way of thinking that doesn't count pollution, that doesn't count depletion of resources, how can we change our way of thinking about economics so that we can start to value all of life? This is a deep cultural question, which religious communities can engage in more by virtue of the fact of just there's a countercultural tradition sometimes in faith communities whereby there is a questioning of mainstream conventional ways. So the fact that we have on our nightly news just the stock market, why is that the measurement that we should be looking at if it doesn't count the things that are driving this crisis? Economic growth measured by GDP doesn't count any of those things either. Why should we be listening to the political leaders say economic growth without talking about the rest of this? So those are some things that we haven't quite solved, but one of the reasons that we do these trainings and that we engage in educational also workshops and classes is that we really believe that those conversations and changing consciousness on that level is really important to get everybody to take more action. And just finally, I want to say that the Center for Earth Ethics, ethics is associated not just with religion, obviously, but with moral philosophy, with questions of right and wrong and good and bad. In some ways, and I think it's very interesting to hear from Eastern traditions and indigenous traditions who might not have that same language. Maybe it's balance and imbalance, right relationship and wrong relationship, harmony and disharmony. But those are questions within the field of ethics that really need to be asked in all sectors of society. And there are times when laws and policies are out of step with people's deep sense of right and wrong. And we are definitely at that time now. So when we're hearing about the youth strikes, when we're seeing with Extinction Rebellion and other forms of nonviolent civil disobedience, this is a time in which people are trying to figure out how to get attention and shake things up because things are so out of step. So Center for Earth Ethics is a pretty young organization. We're about 5-6 years old, but seeking ways to make that impact, and thank you for asking.
Thank you. I just want to make one comment. When we get to talk with different groups and engage with different people, at times there's a question, why engaging with faith traditions? Why working with religious traditions? Why the UN gets involved in certain areas when it's mostly secular, or should perhaps limit itself? And I always use an example that Jeff has heard a million times from me, saying is, let's say that I'm invited, or I show up in Afghanistan, for example, or in India, and I show up and I say, hi, my name is Felipe, I work at the UN. We have an amazing plan for you. It's called Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, 17 goals. You're going to love them. The first thing the community is going to say is like, who are you? You don't look like us. You don't speak my language. You don't speak our language. You don't eat like us. You don't worship like us. So, and you think that you're going to come from the outside and tell us how we have to live our lives because you have a good plan? Go back to the UN and enjoy your life there and just live as them. Now, let's change the narrative and let's say that I engage with a local imam from the mosque, and I can make the connection with the language that we spoke before with Agenda 2030 and the reflection in the Quran, or in the Vedas in Hinduism, or in the Bible in Christianity, and I can make that connection to a local leader who already has the trust of the community. How much more effective will it be, that work, when that leader goes back from the pulpit, or from the mosque, or from the synagogue, or from the place of worship, and explain in the terms that the congregation already knows the message that we have conveyed from the UN? It is key to understand that the connection, the engagement has to happen at certain levels so that we can multiply the effect and maximize the impact. They will not listen to me for as much as I maybe work for the UN, and that sounds super cool, which is super cool, by the way, but and so the concept is, how can I engage with many people? How can I really reach out to the hearts of individuals who can make a difference in the communities? That is through wonderful people like the ones in this panel, is like wonderful people like you. You can reach out to people. These briefings, these sessions are so that you can find a way to present a narrative into the terms that people understand, people who trust you understand. That's why it's so important that you participate and you work with us. And we love working with you, and that is what we exist also. So please, understand that there's a bigger picture into this and a purpose, which is how can we reach out to as many people globally as possible through this kind of approach. More questions? Please. You can say your name and which organization you represent.
María Luisa Chávez, Fundación Cultural Bauer. I have a question more or less following what the comment you just made. And it's a generic question to all the panelists. First of all, thank you very much. It was wonderful. Indeed, you are planting and nurturing the seed of climate responsibility. My question is, do you work in partnership with other faith-based NGOs, or is there a tendency to work in silos? Because that comes back to the question of the connection, the power of connecting and outreaching. So I always have this question with NGOs at large. I mean, do you work in partnerships? Because, you know, the more, you know, working together, making the difference, that power is very there. I mean, or do you work in silos? Thank you.
Whoever wants to address, please. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a good question. So one of the organizations I work for and representing here today is called Green Faith. We're based in New Jersey, and we do international multi-faith climate change work. And I'll give you two examples of how we are bringing together different religious traditions in different parts of the world. First, in India, we have a strong campaign around renewable energy called the Shine campaign, where we did research about 1.5 years ago that showed that all major religious traditions in India are working on renewable energy and have installed solar panels and different things in their places of worship. What we found, though, was a lack of collaboration within traditions and across traditions. So we're working now with Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and Jains and Sikhs across India to develop a common roadmap for how different traditions can work together to scale up advocacy and implementation of renewable energy in India. Because as I mentioned, 200 million people in India still do not have access to reliable energy. And then that's one thing we're doing in India. Here in the US and Europe and Australia, in the so-called developed countries, we have a campaign called Living the Change, which is asking individuals from different religious denominations to make personal lifestyle changes to reduce their carbon footprint. So the three main things we're asking are people to adopt a vegetarian or vegan diet, to reduce their air travel, and to reduce and change their energy consumption. Food, travel, and diet. So food, travel, and energy. And how we do that is we have a core narrative and the core science behind why those actions are impactful from an individual perspective. And then we have our Muslim partners tailoring that science for the Muslim audience and for the Hindu audiences and the Jewish and the Christian and the Buddhist groups and different traditions. And what we're seeing is when people from different traditions, it's almost, unfortunately, sometimes it's like a competition. Oh, the Buddhists are doing it, also the Hindus have to get on that, you know? Or the Christians are doing it, or the Catholics are doing it, the Protestants better step up, right? So sometimes it's a little bit healthy to have it like that, but it's really powerful when people see different traditions stepping up and they feel inspired to step up themselves. Just Pope Francis's encyclical, for example, has inspired so many other non-Catholic organizations across the world to step up their advocacy as well. So that's one way we're doing it.
Thank you. Jill?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one. It's one we hear a lot, and I think one we need to continue thinking about. I think for me, we always have to think about interfaith and intrafaith. I mean, the Anglican Communion is the third largest Christian communion in the world, 85 million people. That there's quite a breadth of understandings of climate change and a lot of other issues just within our one communion. And then if you add the whole Christian tradition and working ecumenically, that becomes an even bigger pool. And so we certainly work with other ecumenical organizations quite closely. The Anglican Alliance that I mentioned is an observer member of the ACT Alliance, for example, which is an ecumenical umbrella organization of humanitarian and development agencies. Many Anglican churches are members of the World Council of Churches, which is an ecumenical organization. But then, of course, on the ground, where there are Anglican churches in communities that are necessarily interfaith, multi-religious communities, there's a lot of work that is done in that way. So I think a lot about Episcopal Relief and Development has programs in Liberia around gender justice and women's rights, and working with both Episcopalian clergy and imams in those communities to talk about issues surrounding gender-based violence, etc. I also know we're a big member of Side by Side, the interfaith movement for gender justice. So my expertise is mostly in gender and peace building. So those are some of the examples that are coming straight to mind, but I'm sure that there are more examples specifically focusing on climate as well. And so the Side by Side movement, interfaith movement for gender justice has national chapters in many countries, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa at this point, but it is spreading. It's also in Europe and in North and South America. So that is one way that we're very intentionally around different issues working interfaith. Also in the UN space, it's very critical. We're not only working ecumenically, but we are sharing spaces around issues that we care about, like this panel, with people of other faith. Exchanging those ideas at this level and also at the grassroots level is really important.
Thank you. Karina?
I would just add to that I think in this time with the urgency that we're facing, first of all, to know who else is working in these spaces is really important. And sometimes I feel at Center for Earth Ethics like we do a lot of referring. So just to be able to field inquiries or needs and say, you know, who's doing that work. It's Green Faith, or it's We Act, or the different organizations that you know already have the expertise. I think that's a really important part of movement building. But I also want to say that there's so much work to do right now that I think I have found that it's good to sometimes lose the organizational kind of fixation on whatever is your organization, the identities and the egos of organizations and the relationships and the network of relationships. Sometimes that can take over, and actually what's more important is to find those communities and people that actually aren't connected to any of the support systems that they need. And right now, when people are standing up to ecological really violence, injustice certainly, and are seeking that kind of help, I think one thing that is important is to be able to show up, and this has happened in my experience, and this is just for whatever reason where I've come across it in fighting the fossil fuel infrastructure build out that happens around pipelines, and many heard of Standing Rock with the Standing Rock Sioux and their allies in conflict with the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that was indigenous-led movement that also garnered a lot of other faith-based support, which I think was a really important moment for many religious and faith communities to see that indigenous leadership and to come together in that way. But there are many, many such cases where there are people standing in their communities who are trying to resist a kind of fossil fuel infrastructure build out or a toxic waste site. And I don't want to pivot your point to another one too much, but it does come to mind that looking for those spaces that actually, where people don't have any organizational affiliation or support is also a really great thing to do right now.
Thank you.
Okay, as I already addressed in my presentation, and Blia, actually, we have over 200 chapters, and we all work over the world, and then with the local governments, and then in other organizations, and then we now work for solo, and then but we ground rooted from the family basis, and then to through all the educations. And we got a couple examples like in Paraguay, and then we work with the local Asian community organization foundations, and then in the hospital, and then for early delivery children and infants, and then the bring up the health, and then the awareness. And also in the South Africa, and then we have the academy to train people to get more skills. We are educated, and then you will have more understanding and then about what's going on in the world, and then can be more connected, and then about bring up all the awareness. So we're also in the locally, and like in based in New York, in Interfaith, of course, in Interfaith Center of New York, and then also the Buddhist Catholic Dialogue, and then we all are working on, and then also with the New York City governments with the mental health and issues, and then everything. Now is we call the interconnectedness. So this is how we all. Everyone, this is for the future. We all have to work together, bring, awareness. But ground root is very important from the family, from the neighborhood, and from the community. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to expand a little bit on the question for Tina. So we know about the interfaith work. We know how different faith traditions work together. How do member states engage with faith traditions to be able to pursue these efforts?
I'm happy to speak to the Marshall Islands. In the Marshall Islands, I'm going to bring it out to climate. For the Marshall Islands, climate it is very much, it's an existential issue. We are looking at, when we say Agenda 2030, for us 2030 is, are we still going to be able to be living here in 2030? Are we still going to be able to live here in 2050? Those are the questions that we're facing. And so the Marshall Islands government has really started a process to engage across all of our society on these really painful and difficult questions that are facing us about who we are and who we want to be and where we're going to be. And so we've had now 3 what we call climate dialogues in different parts of the Marshalls that include youth, they include faith leaders, religious leaders, they include local elected officials, people from the national government, from basically all sectors to talk about climate and to talk about what our future is. And so there's that. I think that's kind of the path that we're taking. But there's also a recognition that we need to do more. I work with a group of people who are across all sectors of the Marshall Islands government talking about what our next thing is, which is adaptation. So we've been really focused over the last 10, 15 years on trying to save the world. And the writing's on the wall for us now, and we really need to focus on how to save ourselves. And so we're seriously considering what do we do to adapt to a world where, sea level rises above 6 feet, and we're at 6 feet. And in those conversations, I've been in many meetings where we're talking about how do we better engage with all of our religious leaders and get the message out through the churches, because that's really, for us, honestly, probably one of the most effective. And in addition to our landowners, our traditional elders, our religious leaders are probably one of the most effective ways to engage with people in our communities.
Thank you so much. More questions on the floor? I see a hand over there. Perfect. Yeah. German? Yeah. There you are. There you are. Nice work, yeah.
So, my name is Javier Reyes, and I'm representing the Augustinians International Organization. And my question is, as religious and spiritual groups, we are working on educating people and taking actions to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in case we fail to accurately or partially meet these goals, how can we as religious or spiritual groups get or be prepared for the future catastrophe, which will only cause desperation and vulnerability to my generation and future generation? It could be a question for any one of you.
I'm going to start from the UN perspective saying that we're hopeful that we'll be able to achieve them. So, and we're working with that mentality. And when people ask us all the time, do you really believe that we can accomplish them? Of course I believe. Otherwise I would not be working at the UN. I would be somewhere else. This is a common endeavor. We hope. We know that the MDGs accomplish a lot. We reduce extreme poverty by 50% globally, and we saw that there are changes happening. Now that we are more aware, now we have better engagement, I would say that the difference between the old goals, the MDGs, the 8 MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, and the 17 Sustainable Goals is the inclusion of the participation of civil society and other actors, the multi-stakeholder participation in the planning process, in the development, in the drafting, and in the agreement of the implementation. And civil society is the monitoring entity, or should be the monitoring entity for member states, so that NGOs can, or civil society can check, oh, Spain is not doing what it's supposed to, my country is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, or the US or so. So there's engagement that needs to happen. Now, what if we don't get to accomplish everything? I will let the people of faith to tell you how they address this. Poor?
We should pray, for sure. But obviously more than that as well. It's a good and it's an important question. And I think I alluded to it in my remarks at the beginning. I think one thing we have to do is we have to be bold in our action for making sure we achieve the SDGs by 2030, that's for sure, and leverage all of the resources and experience and wisdom that we have. But I think you're right, I think we have to be ready just in case we aren't successful. And I think I've noted down 2 things. The first is that we have to really be ready to care for people in a way that I feel I feel that we're just not, and that's across society. We know that there are going to be millions of climate refugees, and we have to not build any walls, and we have to open our borders and make sure that those climate refugees, those migrants, have places to go. And that's going to be a struggle, and it's going to have to be religious voices and spiritual leaders who have to push the envelope on that and say it's our responsibility to take in these people who have nowhere else to go. So I think that's one concrete example, and we're seeing that in many parts of the world already, that religious leaders are going to have to step forward in that way to care for people. And I think the other piece I think is really important, which is something that Corinne has been alluding to, is reshaping our institutions. What does a government look like that makes policy that doesn't harm the environment? What is the economic model that takes into consideration even the word natural resources? Is a phrase that we have to stop using. I was with Mindahi Bastida just a couple of days ago. Many of you know him, indigenous leader. They're not resources, they're elements, and even so we have to change the framing and change our economic and governance models to take into consideration the planetary boundaries that we have, and the fact that the Anthropocene is going to mean that the natural world is going to be a threat to human civilization in a significant way. And then in a very practical way, supporting things like the Green New Deal, like radical shifts to renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. We have to do the spiritual care, which is going to be desperately needed, which should be our forte as spiritual and religious groups. But we also have to see how our spiritual and religious values can play out in different policies, such as the Green New Deal and so on like that. So I would say those are the two things.
Thank you.
Well, how do we prepare for the catastrophe, potential catastrophe? I mean, one, not to be cynical, we're in it. We're in the catastrophe. And I think part of our work as faith-based organizations, as Gopal shared before and as Corinna shared, is to usher in that renewed spirituality to deal with the ecological grief that we're already experiencing, whether we are conscious or aware of it or not. And of course, as we've heard, there are some parts of the world and certain communities of people that are experiencing it much more acutely than others. And I think sometimes it's very easy for us to talk around that pain because it's painful, I think. I think to also build on what to do if we are successful with the SDGs. I think we still have to prepare even if we are successful. If we achieve the SDGs, there's still going to be more steps to take. And I think that there is urgent action that needs to be taken that possibly we haven't yet fully imagined to achieve them in the next 11 years. So I hope that in our faith traditions we can cull up that spirituality and that sustenance, the resilience that we have in our various belief systems to usher us into an era where we can actually have that imagination and to create anew and to create new solutions. I also think that one thing that I was sparked by before that I felt incomplete in my response to the question on interfaith is that too often those of us, especially I'll say for me in working with churches and Christian organizations, is that we get stuck on faiths as the institution, as the capital word, the capital Christianity. And so we have to be mindful to treat our faiths as both institutions and movements. And how do we work to accomplish our goals with the institution vis-a-vis the movement and vice versa. And sometimes, especially when we're working in a number of institutions like the UN and other partners, we need to be mindful of that and how fluid that is. And when we also talk about climate refugees and the care that's going to be needed, and working interfaith, we'll often forget indigenous spiritualities as something that's really critical. Within the Anglican Communion, in addition to the environmental network, there are a number of other networks, and there's also the Anglican Indigenous Network. And they have a very strong call as well, and from perhaps a different perspective than many in the environmental network. And so ensuring that we're engaging that traditional knowledge that is key to this climate crisis, can't be forgotten. It needs to be lifted up more, especially when we're talking about interfaith and faith-based organizations. Sometimes it gets left out.
Thank you. Karina? No? Lee? Perfect.
Okay. I'm not the super optimistic, but I have the comments about education. And so I just said in my presentation, and then if we want to live a greener and then the lifestyles, the build up a little habits and for potentially can make the dramatic difference, then we can do in everyone in our daily lives. And then in the Buddhism, the future, it's all depends on now, on the current. So that's all the dependent origination. So the cause and effect, if we want the future, we don't want to fail, then we have to focus on, and then from everyone is doing from now and then today, and from your habits and then everyone's habits. You less of the bottled water and use the furnace with you everywhere, and use your own utensil, and then use handkerchiefs instead of napkins or a paper towel, and that's a little bit by little bit, and build up. That's our future. And then I do believe, and then every one of us in Buddhism, as a Buddhist, we believe ourselves, and then we can change the future, and then the power is within us, the strength is within us, if as long as we believe it, and then we want it, we want to build it. So I would never think about the fairness in the future for the 2030, the SDG goals. It just, we can see that things has two sizes. We might not, we so-call the successful. How do you define the success and reach the goal? As long as we have the progress and we are working on it and we're doing, and then we do our best, that's the best for all us. And then we do our best for our future generation, for us, when we get older. And then we still have electricity, we still have trees, and then we still have water. I think for us, that's our faith in the Buddhism. We do believe taking care of the current and now, and then that actions made the changes for the future.
Thank you.
I want to add a few comments. I think it's an important question. There are scholarly works out now on this matter, like The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, Falter by Bill McKibben, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable by Amitav Ghosh, and there's been work by Elizabeth Colbert on the Sixth Great Extinction. I mention those because I do think it's these conversations dealing with that topic are necessarily moral and spiritual in nature, and the involvement of people who are thinking about those matters from communities and traditions of faith is really critical to guide that from the deep wells of the world's religious and wisdom and indigenous traditions. I wanted to say something about the Sustainable Development Goals that, climate is number 13. And I've often thought that of how one could have a policy in which you could meet many other of the goals, but actually it could involve opening up a bunch of coal mines or something like that. And I don't say that to be critical of the SDGs, but just as a reminder that what we're talking about with the climate crisis is so wide in scope and so urgent and so severe that none of those other efforts can afford to not go through the lens of goal number 13. And we know as a driver of global conflict and poverty and hunger, it is just hugely important. And on that note, I just want to say that there is a theological thinker, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which some may be familiar with, and this theologian, Cynthia Mo Lebeda, recently reinterpreted him as well, I don't know if she calls herself an ecofeminist. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that he talked about structural sin. And and he was German. He was executed for going to resist Hitler and the Nazis. But he said one element of structural sin is that it easily masquerades as good. And so that again goes into when we look at how we're organizing our societies, what our discourse is about when we're talking about economic development, even things like ending poverty. There are things that are being done in the name of jobs, in the name of economic growth, that are just accelerating climate disaster. So I think it's really important to think about being more vigilant about that and how we can really look clearly at the range of the Sustainable Development Goals through that lens of number 13. Finally, I just want to echo something that was said about so many good things said by my fellow panelists. Thank you. But in this time, with suffering, with death, with grief, that we need to be prepared to change our capacity to reach out and care for others. Also, in terms of connecting to natural cycles in the natural world, I love that traditional indigenous knowledge was lifted up. I think reconnecting to place on a practical level, seriously, with disaster coming, reconnecting to place, supporting those who are doing food sovereignty, and connecting, and those who come from traditions, and this point is made in The Great Derangement, the Amitav Ghosh book, that there are experts in lots of things to do with science and technology. They're also experts in relating to the natural world. Shamanic traditional traditions are not to be dismissed and marginalized, especially when we're dealing with coming to a new type of relationship with place in this world that is going to be so rapidly changing. So I just wanted to add those comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of the briefing. I'll lead the floor, though, for Dr. Shaw.
Thank you.
Very quick.
Okay. I want to thank the panel. It's been a wonderful presentation. I'm Dr. Holly Shaw, and I very proudly represent the International Council of Nurses and the Nightingale Initiative for Global Health. And I'm here today with 40 nurses of the Society of Nurse Scientists, Innovators, Entrepreneurs, and Leaders, and also Dr. Barbara Sattler, who represents the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. And I just want to share the good news that nurses are involved in leading very innovative changes, both in healthcare delivery, but also healthcare systems who need to be involved in these, and providing very creative humanity-focused solutions to some of these complex problems, as well as being experts in caring and human relationships. So I'm very glad that they're here with me today and sharing this wonderful experience. And though your focus is faith-based, in terms of partnerships, we're all in this together, and nurses certainly know how to lead the way to health and healing. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. And I agree. We need... Thank you to the wonderful nurses that take care of us. And I agree that we need to just reach out across and then engage with as many partners as possible. If there's one thing I take from today's briefing, I think is the idea that there's a sense of urgency. We need to act now. There's no time to waste. We need to engage. And as people of faith, I happen to be a man of faith who happens to be an international civil servant at the UN. I think it is a moral imperative. It is our duty and obligation to make sure that we contribute to the betterment of society for everyone, not just for ourselves. Caring for our neighbors, loving our neighbors, the golden rule applies in all aspects of society and all aspects of life. And in the faith component is a tremendous driving force for good in the world. And good can be manifested into the three chairs that we don't want to be empty, the poor and the needy, but also the environment, or the other species, and the future generations or the young generations. I would say that it's important that young people are involved today. We cannot wait until 2030 and expect that they will inherit a world that has been planned and developed for them. The engagement has to happen there, and the faith component of it is very important. Also, I want to invite you to a very important event that we have in August. Following this trend of engaging with different partners, August 26th to 28th, we'll have the 68th UN Civil Society Conference in Salt Lake City, Utah. And it is titled Building Inclusive and Sustainable Cities and Communities. We will have an approach also from the faith perspective on how to be able to collaborate together to make societies a better place. And societies that I think is important what Tina has said. There are people who are facing today their own existence tomorrow. And we cannot, that is a crisis, that is a catastrophe that is happening right now. My question then is, and it's an open question to finish, is what can we do, but what can you do? And how will you contribute to the conversation? How will you contribute to the betterment of society for everyone? I hope that you have found in this panel inspiration. I have definitely. I think that I'm a better person today than I was yesterday because of this and a few minutes ago. And I hope that all of you feel the same, that hopefully we can engage more and we can explore together how we can collaborate and make the world a better place for everyone. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.